In the heart of Central Florida, far from the noise of Orlando's theme parks, lies Seminole County. It's a place of horse pastures, suburban homes, and quiet neighborhoods where families could expect a life that seemed safe and ordinary. This was where Margaret and Chad Amato decided to settle down, to raise their 3 boys in what looked from the outside like the picture of the American dream. Margaret was compassionate, known for her love of animals. She rescued and fostered a former racehorse that had been abused, pouring time and care into its recovery. She opened her stables to neighborhood children, introducing them to the world of horses with patience and warmth. Chad, her husband, had a reputation for being a hard worker and a devoted father. He loved football, particularly the Florida Gators, and took his sons to games whenever he could. The Amato's 3 children grew up in this world of small town comfort. The eldest, Jason, eventually moved out, marrying and starting his own family. The 2 younger brothers, Cody and Grant, remained close to home. Their bond was unusually tight. They were only a year apart in age, which meant they grew up almost as twins, playing paintball, gaming, watching anime, and even joining the same high school weightlifting team. They didn't just share hobbies, they shared dreams. Cody, the older of the 2, was ambitious and focused. He decided to become a licensed nurse anesthetist, a prestigious and demanding medical role. Grant idolized his brother so deeply that he followed him into the same career path, hoping to become exactly what Cody was. Together they enrolled in nursing school, and their parents couldn't have been prouder. For years, it seemed as though everything in the Amato family was unfolding perfectly. Jason secure with his own family, Cody and Grant advancing into stable careers, and Margaret and Chad still at the center of their sons' lives. Up until the summer of 2018, the Amatos represented what many would call an ideal American family. A comfortable home, loving parents, children on the path to success. But behind the walls of that Seminole County house, something fragile was beginning to crack. Something that would eventually explode into one of the most shocking family murders Florida had ever seen. Grant's early struggles of the 3 sons. Grant Amato was the one who seemed to struggle most with expectations. He was quieter, less confident, and often leaned on Cody for guidance. Where Cody's life had momentum, Grant seemed slower, heavier. Still, he admired his brother so much that he tried to follow directly in his footsteps. Both Grant and Cody attended nursing school together. While Cody thrived, Grant struggled with the pressure and the discipline required. Yet, he kept pushing forward, desperate not to fall behind. After graduating, both secured jobs at local hospitals. Cody advanced quickly. Grant, however, began to falter. In 2018, Grant faced a crisis that would permanently alter his trajectory. He was accused of stealing medication, a serious offense in a hospital setting. Whether it was desperation, carelessness, or poor judgment, the act ended his career before it had even begun. He was terminated from his job, suddenly cut adrift from the one stable path he had managed to carve out. For Cody, this was a disappointment, but not a fatal one. He tried to encourage his brother, to support him, and to remind him that family would always be there. For Grant, however, the humiliation of losing his job was crushing. He was left with no sense of identity, no career, and no purpose. The beginning of an obsession at first, Grant retreated to the safety of his family home. Margaret and Chad did what parents often do. They tried to support him. They hoped he could regain his footing, maybe find another job or return to school. Grant, however, turned inward. He became increasingly isolated, spending endless hours online. What began as casual gaming and browsing quickly evolved into something darker. On the internet, Grant discovered the world of cam models, women who performed dances, or intimate acts on live video streams in exchange for money. For a man as lonely and directionless as Grant, the pull was powerful. Through one of these platforms, he met Sylvie, a young woman from Bulgaria. She was beautiful, glamorous, and exotic in a way that seemed completely out of reach for Grant in his ordinary life. Their relationship began with small interactions, a smile, a greeting, an exchange of words. But on these platforms, attention came at a price. The more money a man spent, the more time and affection he received in return. Grant was quickly hooked. He began sending Sylvie money, small amounts at first, then larger sums. The thrill of her recognition filled the emptiness left by his failed career. In his mind, it felt like a real relationship. Sylvie became the center of his world. He began telling himself she was his girlfriend, despite the reality that she lived thousands of miles away and was only accessible through a camera. Money vanishes at first. Grant used what money he had left, but his obsession grew uncontrollable. He began spending thousands of dollars, sometimes $1,000 to $2,000 a day, to keep Sylvie's attention. He sent her lingerie and gifts, urging her to model them for him. He recorded videos, replayed chats, and convinced himself their bond was genuine. Inevitably, his personal funds dried up, and so he turned to the people closest to him, his family. Grant drained his own savings, then moved to his brother Cody's money. Cody, loyal and compassionate, covered some of the debts without initially questioning why. But the deception didn't stop there. Grant began forging his parents' signatures, running up charges on their credit cards, and even taking out loans against the family's mortgage. At one point, his father Chad had to re-mortgage the house to cover the losses. In total, Grant funneled nearly $200,000 into Sylvie's world, money that represented not just financial ruin but also betrayal. For Margaret and Chad, who had spent their lives building stability, the revelation was devastating. For Cody, who had always believed in his brother, it was a bitter betrayal of trust. Family confrontations. By late 2018, the truth was unavoidable. Grant's obsession had spiraled beyond control, and his family could no longer ignore the damage. They confronted him, demanding he stop speaking to Sylvie, get professional help, and take responsibility for what he had done. The Amatos gave Grant an ultimatum. If he wanted to continue living under their roof, he would have to get a job and start contributing, end all contact with Sylvie, apologize to his family for the theft and deception. Reluctantly, Grant agreed. His parents sent him to a behavioral health clinic in South Florida for treatment. The plan was for him to spend 2 months there, dealing with his depression and internet addiction. But Grant lasted fewer than 2 weeks before leaving. When he returned home, nothing had changed. The Amatos tried again to set boundaries. Chad, increasingly frustrated, warned his son that he could not live at home unless he obeyed the rules. Grant was furious. In his mind, Sylvie was not just a fantasy. She was the only thing that gave him meaning. Cutting off contact with her was, to him, unbearable. The final straw. Despite their patience, Margaret and Chad could not save their youngest son from himself. On one occasion, after promising never to call Sylvie again, Grant persuaded his mother to let him use her phone. Within minutes, he was back in contact with the Bulgarian model, desperate for her attention. When Chad discovered this betrayal, his patience snapped. At dinner one night, Chad confronted his son. He laid out the terms clearly. If Grant contacted Sylvie again, he would be thrown out of the house permanently. No more second chances. No more forgiveness. Chad was firm. Grant would pack his things and leave if he disobeyed. For a man like Grant, already fragile, isolated, and consumed by obsession, the ultimatum felt like the end of the world. In his mind, his family wasn't trying to save him. They were trying to destroy him. By cutting him off from Sylvie, they were erasing the only relationship he believed he had. Grant later claimed that during this confrontation, his father threatened him directly, saying that if he ever stepped foot back on the property after being kicked out, Chad would kill him. Whether this was true or an invention of Grant's unstable mind, it added fuel to an already combustible situation. The next day, Grant was officially kicked out of the family home. He checked into a motel nearby, stewing in resentment, convinced that his parents and brother were conspiring against him. From that moment on, the fragile peace within the Amato family was shattered. The American dream shattered from the outside. The Amatos still looked like a normal suburban family. Neighbors saw Margaret tending to her horses, Chad cheering on the Gators, and Cody continuing his career in nursing. But inside the house, tensions had reached a breaking point. Grant's obsession with Sylvie had transformed from a private addiction into a destructive force that threatened the very foundation of the family. He had stolen from those who loved him most. He had lied repeatedly. He had rejected every attempt to help him. And now, after losing his career, his money, and the trust of his family, Grant Amato was about to lose something even greater. For in the weeks that followed, his desperation, fueled by an online fantasy and years of growing isolation, would culminate in violence so brutal and shocking that it would forever destroy the family he once called his own. The year was 2018, and the Amato household in Seminole County, Florida, was no longer the place of warmth and comfort it had once been. On the outside, it still looked like an ordinary suburban home, the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other on morning walks. But inside, a battle was unfolding. A battle between a family desperate to save one of their own, and a son who was slipping further and further into an obsession that consumed everything. At the center of it all was Grant Amato and his fixation on a Bulgarian woman named Sylvie. What had started as an online fantasy had spiraled into a dependency so destructive that it fractured every bond in his life. By now, the family had poured nearly 200,000 into his addiction. Savings, mortgages, even the financial security of their future. They had tried everything: interventions, ultimatums, treatment programs. But nothing was enough to separate Grant from Sylvie. As 2018 drew to a close, the pressure inside the Amato household reached a breaking point, and the events that followed would set the stage for one of Florida's most shocking family tragedies: life in the motel. After being kicked out of the family home, Grant checked into a motel nearby. To anyone passing by, he was just another guest, another quiet man behind closed doors. But inside that room, his obsession continued. Even without steady income, he found ways to keep paying Sylvie. Sometimes he used his mother's phone, sometimes he tapped into funds he had stolen earlier, and sometimes he manipulated Cody into giving him money under the guise of small needs. But the truth was always the same: every dollar, every favor, every lie. It all went to Sylvie. To Grant, she was more than just a woman on a screen. She was the answer to the emptiness he had carried for years. She gave him attention, even if it was bought. She smiled when he paid, responded to his compliments, and fulfilled his fantasies. In his mind, it felt like a real relationship, stronger, even, than the ties to his own family. The ultimatum: Margaret and Chad Amato loved their son, but their patience was wearing thin. They had sacrificed too much, and Grant had shown no progress. After his brief, failed stint at the behavioral clinic, Chad set down a clear ultimatum. If Grant wanted to live at home again, he would have to obey strict rules. He would get a job, he would cut off contact with Sylvie, and he would work to rebuild the trust he had shattered. Otherwise, he was out, for good. It was a last attempt at saving him, a final hope that he might see the damage he was causing and turn back. But to Grant, it was something very different. In his mind, his family wasn't trying to help him. They were trying to control him, to separate him from the one thing that gave him purpose. The tension in the house became unbearable. Arguments erupted, not just between Grant and his parents, but also between him and his brother Cody, the one person he had once idolized. Cody had offered to help pay off Grant's debts. He had stood by him through his mistakes. But even Cody was reaching the end of his patience. When Chad discovered that Grant had used Margaret's phone to contact Sylvie after promising he wouldn't, it was the final straw. In a heated confrontation, Chad told his son he was no longer welcome in the house. Grant would leave and not return. According to Grant, his father added a chilling threat. If Grant ever stepped foot on the property again, Chad would kill him. Whether Chad truly said those words or not, only Grant knows. But in his mind, that sentence became a spark. To him, it wasn't just an ultimatum, it was war. The isolation deepens. Grant moved his belongings to the motel. For the first time in his life, he was completely cut off from the family structure that had always protected him. Jason, the eldest brother, lived away with his own family. Margaret and Chad had drawn their line, and Cody, once his inseparable companion, now stood firmly on their side. But instead of trying to repair the damage, Grant sank deeper into his world. He spent hours online with Sylvie, still convinced she was the only person who understood him. He told himself that the connection was real, even as his money disappeared and his family's patience turned to anger. For Grant, there was no alternative. Without Sylvie, he was nothing. Without her, his life was empty, meaningless. The pressure built day after day, until resentment hardened into something darker. The last argument on January 24, 2019, just one day before the murders, the tension reached its peak. Grant had once again violated the rules. He had found a way to contact Sylvie. When his parents discovered this, they called him to a family meeting at a local restaurant. The conversation was not gentle. Chad and Margaret laid down the terms once more: no Sylvie, no internet obsession, no more theft. If he disobeyed again, he was finished. Grant's brother Cody joined in, reminding Grant of all the chances he had been given, all the sacrifices the family had made for him. But Grant wasn't listening. To him, their words weren't expressions of love, they were betrayals. They had taken Sylvie from him, cut him off from his only escape. He sat there, seething, believing that his family had ruined his life. When Chad told him to pack up and leave, it was the breaking point. Grant stormed out, his mind churning with resentment, fear, and rage. In his twisted perspective, his family wasn't saving him, they were destroying him. The last night that evening, Grant returned to the motel. He was alone, but not disconnected. He still had Sylvie. He logged back onto the chat room, spent money he didn't have, and lost himself in the illusion of her affection. But reality pressed in from all sides. He had no job, no money, and no home. His parents had turned against him. His brother, his lifelong companion, was now his enemy, and in his mind it all traced back to one thing. They had taken Sylvie away. For hours, he stewed in bitterness. He imagined the life he could have had with Sylvie, the life his family had stolen. By dawn, his obsession had transformed into something more dangerous than fantasy. The morning of the murders, on the morning of January 25, 2019, the Amato home was quiet. Margaret sat at her desk, working on her computer. Chad was in the kitchen, his lunch bag nearby, as though he had just returned home. Cody was entering through the garage, carrying the weight of another long shift. What happened next can never be fully known. The only people present were the victims and the killer, but investigators would later piece together a chilling sequence of events. Grant returned to the family home, despite his father's ultimatum. Inside, a confrontation erupted. Whether it began with words or actions is unclear, but what followed was undeniable: a brutal, calculated execution. Margaret was shot at her desk. Chad was gunned down in the kitchen. Cody, the brother who had once been his closest friend, was shot as he entered through the garage. Each was killed quickly, leaving no chance for defense. When it was over, 3 members of the Amato family lay dead in their own home, victims of the very son and brother they had spent years trying to save. A staged scene when detectives arrived later that day, called for a wellness check after family members failed to show up for work. They found a crime scene that was both horrifying and suspicious. 3 bodies, no sign of forced entry, no valuables missing, but there were details that didn't add up. A pistol lay next to Cody's body, positioned as though to suggest he had been the shooter. On Chad's hip, a gun rested awkwardly in a holster, backward. Inconsistent with how a right-handed man would wear it, it looked staged, as if someone had tried to create the illusion of a murder-suicide. To detectives, one question stood out: where was Grant Amato, the missing son? As investigators combed the house, they realized one member of the family was missing. Grant was nowhere to be found. A man who should have been grieving, who should have been frantic with worry, was absent from the most tragic moment of his family's life. It didn't take long to track him down. He had checked into a motel, not far from the home. Detectives arrived, cautious, unsure of what they would find. When they knocked on the door, Grant opened it calmly. He was wearing hospital scrubs, no blood, no signs of a struggle. He didn't resist when they asked him to come with them for questioning. As they escorted him to the Seminole County Sheriff's office, one thought lingered in every detective's mind: how could a man walk away from a scene like that without a trace of blood, without evidence, without even a flicker of emotion? The beginning of the interrogation, Detective Eva Marie Monterey and her partner Danny Anderson sat down with Grant, prepared to unravel the truth. On paper, he was now the prime suspect, but in person he seemed almost ordinary, calm, polite, even cooperative. His parents had just been executed. His brother had been slaughtered. But when asked what happened, Grant gave the same answer, over and over: "I don't know what happened." The detectives pressed him, pulling at threads, hoping to break through the mask. but Grant's face remained almost expressionless. He insisted he hadn't returned to the house after leaving. He claimed he had no idea what had happened to his family, yet there was something in his eyes that unsettled the investigators. He wasn't grieving. He wasn't even curious. Not once did he ask the question any innocent son might have asked, "Are they okay? Are they alive?" Instead, he sat calmly, repeating his story, insisting he knew nothing. And for the detectives, that calmness was more chilling than any outburst could have been. The walls closing in as the interrogation unfolded, the detectives began to confront Grant with evidence, not physical proof, but logical inconsistencies, gaps in his story, and the overwhelming suspicion that no one else could have committed the crime. They reminded him of his debts, his obsession, his family's ultimatum. They suggested that perhaps an argument had turned violent, that perhaps he hadn't meant for it to happen. They gave him every opportunity to explain, but Grant stayed firm. He didn't know. He wasn't there. He had left, and whatever happened afterward was a mystery. Yet even as he denied it, his demeanor told another story. Calm, detached, almost resigned. For the detectives, it was the beginning of a long battle. A battle not just to prove that Grant Amato had killed his family, but to unravel the twisted psychology that had led him there. The Amato family was gone. Margaret, Chad, and Cody. 3 lives cut short in the very place they should have felt safest. Their quiet Seminole County home had been transformed into a crime scene that detectives described as haunting. It was not just the brutality of the murders that shocked investigators, but the cold precision of the staging. A gun placed by Cody's body, as if to suggest suicide. A holster on Chad's hip, but backwards for a right-handed man. Shell casings laid out to match the number of wounds. It was a scene that looked less like reality and more like a twisted theater production. And the missing son, Grant Amato, was the glaring question mark. A calm suspect when detectives located Grant at a motel just miles from the crime scene. They expected confrontation, maybe even panic. Instead, they found him calm. He agreed to go with them without protest. He was dressed in scrubs, no blood, no evidence of a struggle, no outward signs of guilt. But what chilled detectives most wasn't what they saw, it was what they didn't. Grant showed no concern. He never asked if his parents were okay. He never asked what had happened. It was as though he already knew. Inside the interrogation room, Detective Eva, Marie Monterey and her partner, Danny Anderson, prepared for a long night. They had dealt with hardened suspects before, but Grant was different. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't emotional. He was distant, polite, and eerily detached. The interrogation at first, Grant stuck to his story. He had left the house after the argument with his father and hadn't returned. Whatever happened afterward, he claimed, he didn't know. But the detectives weren't buying it. They pressed harder, laying out scenarios, trying to draw out inconsistencies. Your dad was angry, they suggested. Maybe things got heated. Maybe it was self-defense. Maybe you were protecting your mom. Grant shook his head. He repeated the same words over and over. I don't know what happened. For hours, the detectives tried everything. They showed him crime scene photos. They told him the evidence pointed to him. They even suggested that he was afraid to admit the truth because of embarrassment, not guilt. But Grant's demeanor never changed. He was calm, withdrawn, almost robotic. When the photos of his dead family were placed before him, he wiped at his eyes. But detectives later testified that they didn't believe it was genuine. One described it as a fake cry, a performance without emotion. The hidden truth as detectives peeled back the layers, a disturbing truth began to emerge. Grant wasn't just a failed nursing student or a depressed young man. He was a man consumed by a digital fantasy. Through the investigation, detectives uncovered the full scope of his obsession with Sylvie, the Bulgarian cam model. They found bank records, online chats, receipts for lingerie and gifts. They traced nearly 200,000 funneled from his parents, his brother, and even extended family into her account. They learned that just hours after the murders, while his family lay dead in their home, Grant logged into the cam site from a supermarket parking lot and spent nearly $600 on Sylvie. It was a revelation that left even seasoned detectives stunned. His family was gone, but his first instinct was to return to her. The brother's plea, When 8 hours of interrogation produced no confession, detectives tried one last tactic. They brought in Jason Amato, the eldest brother, who had already been cleared as a suspect.